Ariful. Start the recording, and it's yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon. So this talk is about matrix multiplication, sparse matrix multiplication, especially in order to consider how to avoid communication and in a setting where memory is very limited. So this is joint work between Taufique, Hussain, Ariful, Azad from Indiana University, and Oguz, Selvitopi, and Aydin, Buluç from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So in sparse matrix multiplication, we multiply two sparse matrices, and the result is another sparse matrix. And typically, the output matrix is denser than input matrices. There are many applications of sparse matrix multiplication. For example, in algebraic multigrid, in graph clustering, between decentralized computation, and many other graph algorithms. In this work, our goal is to compute SPGM at extreme scale, especially with extremely large matrices. So here is one particular application that we cared a lot. This application is called Markov clustering that can be used to cluster protein sequences. And in this clustering algorithm, we have to repeatedly multiply a sparse matrix. And how this problem can be interesting, here is one particular example matrix called metaclass 50. This matrix stores similarities of proteins from a particular dataset called metaclass 50. So this matrix, for this particular matrix, we have 282 million proteins. That means we can create a similarity matrix with 282 million rows. And this matrix has 37 billion non-zeros. Now, if we square this matrix, the output of this matrix, that means A times A, will have 1 trillion non-zero. And the number of floating point operations that we have to perform to compute this is 92 trillion. Now, if we store this matrix, if we store this output in memory, we'll need about 24 terabyte of memory. And in SPGM computation, in the worst case, we may need up to 2.2 petabyte memory if our multiplication is done in a certain way. So we can observe from this example that matrix multiplication, sparse matrix multiplication may need lots of memory, and the computation can be super expensive. So our paper is about this particular setting, like we'd like to consider matrix multiplication at extreme scale, and that require huge amount of memory to compute. So what we can do to address these extreme scale problems? So first issue is a huge amount of computation. Like for this particular setting, we talked about this, we need 92 trillion floating point operation. And in order to solve this in a reasonable amount of time, we need thousands of computing nodes of a supercomputer. The main challenge here, how to scale this to thousands of nodes, is main challenge is this operation is communication bound. And our solution is to use communication avoiding algorithms. However, this part here, if our memory requirement is up to 2.2 petabyte, the challenge here is we may not have enough memory even in the entire supercomputer. For example, Cori has only 1.09 petabyte memory. So even if we use entire Cori, we cannot solve this problem. So our solution is we would like to generate results in batches, and applications can consume one batch at a time before we generate the next batch. So in our paper, this is our main contribution. How can you combine these two concepts, memory efficient algorithm and communication avoiding algorithm? So we unified communication avoiding and memory constant SPGM, and it has two impacts. We enable scaling applications to millions of threads, and we can multiply matrices needing petabytes of memory. So how can we batch matrix multiplication so that we can bypass the memory limitation? So we do this in a very simple way called batching. Here, a batch is a subset of columns in the output matrix. So in this example, these two columns creates our first batch. And there are many other ways to create batching, but we create in this way because in graph processing, if we store vertices in one column, all edges adjacent to a vertex in one column, then we are saying we can create all necessary information for a subset of vertices, and then we can process them before we process next set of vertices. And that is why we create batches in this way. And for example, in our original example, Markov clustering, where we can create entries for a subset of vertices, and then we can keep, let's say, top k entries from each column. So in this way, batching can help with this particular application. So we create output batch by batch. In this example, let's say this is our first batch, we generate it first, and then application consumes it. And then we generate the second batch, and the application consumes it, and so on. One obvious side effect of this is we may need to communicate the first matrix more than once. So if we need more batches, it can impact the communication complexity. So this is one side, like how can we bypass the memory restriction? And the second aspect is how can we avoid communication? So in order to avoid communication, what we do is we distribute the matrices in a 3D process grid. Suppose we have two input matrices, A and B, and suppose we have a process grid, 3D process grid with 2 layers, and each layer we have 2 by 2 processors. So that means we have 8 processes. We create 2 by 2 by 2 process grid. So we have 2 layers, each layer 2 by 2. So how can we distribute our input matrices on this process grid, to perform matrix multiplication? So for the first matrix, what we do initially, we consider only one layer and put this matrix onto this 2D process grid. And this is our layout if we put that matrix in a 2D process grid. After we do that, we kind of consider strips. So for example, 2 columns, since we have 2 layers, so we divide every process in a particular layer into 2 parts. And here I'm coloring them using red and blue. Then red part will go to layer 1, and then blue part will go to layer 2. Similarly for other processes. So we put the entire matrix on a single layer, logical single layer, and then divide it into number of layers. And this way we distribute the matrix onto a 3D process grid. This is how we do for A matrix. Since we are using some sort of outer product based matrix multiplication, for B, the first step is exactly the same. That means we put B on one layer, but when we distribute this across the third dimension, we split the matrix horizontally. So that means this part, red part, and this red part will go to layer 1, and this part will go to layer 2. When we're done with the distribution, we have a setting like this. That means for layer 1, this is our A matrix, and this is our B matrix. For layer 2, this is our A matrix, this is our B matrix. Then each layer can compute this matrix multiplication separately. So this is like a 2D matrix multiplication now. So this 2D matrix multiplication can be performed by 2D SUMA algorithm, which was developed earlier. And here, since we are also using batching, because we assume that we cannot store we cannot perform this multiplication with our available memory. The shaded region represent, this is our current batch. Here I'm assuming that we need 2 batches. So this is batch 1 shaded region, and then white region there batch 2, and we'll process them later. So how can we now compute this multiplication? So for layer 1, to perform this 2D SUMA algorithm, they are separate 2D multiplication algorithm. The first step is we broadcast matrices along the process row for A, and then we broadcast matrices along the process column for B. So after we receive the data, we perform local multiplication, and then the output matrix for every layer will look like this. This is kind of like outer product because we are doing SUMA, and SUMA is outer product based matrix multiplication. So we have a bigger expanded matrix for C in every layer. But here, this column represents partial result of the original output. So we have to communicate across layers. So we communicate this way. And then after we perform this all-to-all across layers, we merge those operations. We call this merge fiber operation. That means when we perform all-to-all across layers, we receive an adequate data and then we merge it. For example, here we have red and blue dots, we merge it to get the final result. And then we can shrink it to a proper shape, which is the shape of the A matrix. And this is our 3D distributed output matrix C. So here we are using both communication avoiding algorithm, which is 3D matrix multiplication, as well as the batching concept. And at this point, we have generated output for batch 1. The application can process it in a way it likes, and then we can go ahead and process batch 2. And if we have more batches, we can process in this way. So what are the impacts of those two things? Number of layers in 3D algorithms and number of batches in batch multiplication. So here is one particular example. Here we are considering different number of layers, L equal 1 to 16, and then different number of batches for each layer. And for every setting, we see this trend. The time to broadcast the first matrix A will increase dramatically as you increase B, number of batches, because you have to communicate the first matrix more than once. So our goal is to find a value of B, that is the smallest value of B, so that we can perform this multiplication. This value is determined by the available memory of the system, as well as the nature of multiplication. That means it depends on the input matrices. And we solve this by performing a symbolic step. And that symbolic step is also a communication avoiding symbolic step. We perform this, and then we determine the necessary required memory, and then we find optimum B. And the second observation is in terms of number of layers. So here I'm just considering the last one, which is batch for a fixed batch 64. The blue line represents a broadcast time. So when you increase number of layers, the broadcast time decreases. But the all-to-all time across multiple layers, which is represented by this red part, it increases. So we have to identify this and we have to balance this out so that when we increase number of layers, broadcast time may decrease, but all-to-all communication may increase. So our goal is to minimize. We'd like to increase number of layers, but with a goal that we have to minimize the broadcast plus all-to-all time. The total broadcast and all-to-all time, we have to minimize this. This is our goal. While it is not possible to find the optimum value of number of layers without running the multiplication, but our rule of thumb is if we have P processes, then P to the power 1 over 3 may work well in practice. We have discussed the logic in the paper. And there is another third component, that is, if we consider all those steps, broadcast, local multiplication, merging, and all-to-all, and then merge after this all-to-all, we have 3 computation: local multiplication, merging within a layer, and merging across layers. We found out that these steps, typically when we represent matrices in column sorted format, we can use heap or some other algorithm to merge it. But here, we don't need to sort it within a column, because the output of this local multiplication will be processed by the next merging step. So if we don't sort the local multiply result, then the next one can work on this. And there is a good data structure for this, which is hash table. So if we multiply matrices or merge matrices by using hash table, then we don't have to keep matrices sorted. And it can save a lot of computational time. In many cases, we have seen that by using a new hash-based merging algorithm, our computation is about 5x faster than previous heap-based merging algorithms. So those are 3 contributions of the paper. How can we multiply matrices within limited memory? how can we integrate this approach with communication avoiding algorithm, and how can we make computation faster? The overall impact of this is we can get extreme scalability. For example, here is the same matrix that we discussed earlier with 37 billion non-zeros. We could scale to 4,000 nodes of Horizon per computer, and it scales nicely. And then the main impact here is since we need, for example, on 256 nodes, we need 46 batches. On 1,000 nodes, we need 19 batches. On 4,000 nodes, we need 7 batches. So without batching, we cannot perform this multiplication. That is the first thing. And then with batching and with communication avoiding scheme, we can scale to 4,000 nodes quite easily. And if we use hyperthreading, we are actually scaling SPGM to 1 million threads, which is unprecedented, because in our previous work, we could scale without communication avoiding and this type of approaches, we could scale to at most 1,000 nodes. And we have real impact on a real application. I started with this particular application called HeapMCL, parallel Markov clustering. And we see that this bar here represent 4 batches and 1 layer. That means 2D matrix multiplication. The next bar represent a 3D algorithm with 16 layers, but you may need more batches because you are dealing with more unmerged data. That means you may need 8 batches. And this is an iterative algorithm, so I am showing 6 iterations. And we can see that if we run this without batching, then we cannot perform this application, because in all iterations, we need batchings because we don't have enough memory to store it. And for every iteration, we observe that this combination of memory efficient and communication avoiding algorithm will make every iteration at about 2x faster. So in conclusion, this work is about how to minimize communication and how to work with limited memory in performing matrix multiplication. And our contribution is how can you unify communication avoiding and memory constraint SPGM with this impact that we can scale to millions of threads, and we can multiply matrices that will need petabytes of memory. Thank you for your attention. Our code is available as part of the combinatorial BLAST library, and our work is supported by DOE Office of Science. Thank you.